Hello everyone, today's video is all about a company purchasing its own shares. So why would a SME business, an owner-managed business, decide to buy back its own shares? So we're not talking about a PLC or a FTSE listed business buying back their own shares, which will affect you as an investor. I've done a separate video on this. This is all about small companies wanting to buy back shares. So why would they do it? So let's take a look at this example here. We have a trading company and we have two director shareholders, Mr. X and Mr. Y. And let's say that Mr. X is 40 years old and Mr. Y is 60 years old. Mr. Y wants to take things a bit easier, he wants to retire. But Mr. X, he's still hungry to keep going, doesn't want to sell out. He's saying, look, I don't want to sell the whole thing, I want to keep going. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll buy back your shares. So Mr. X wants to buy back Mr. Y's shares. Mr. Y says, yeah, that's fine. But then Mr. X thinks, well, hang on a minute, I don't actually have the funds to buy back the shares from Mr. Y. But what happens if he did have the funds? If Mr. X did have the funds, then he would pay the money over to Mr. Y, and Mr. Y, assuming he's been a director shareholder for at least 2 years, and we've got this thing 50-50, so he's got 50%, which is more than the minimum of 5% for entrepreneurs relief to apply, or business asset disposal relief as it's called, but affectionately known to everyone in the tax world as entrepreneurs relief. He should get his entrepreneurs relief. So let's assume that his share of the business is $500,000. The whole thing is worth $1 million. He's getting half for his, no minority discount for valuation in this instance. Let's just say the agreed amount, £500,000. Mr. X pays Mr. Y, and Mr. Y gets $500,000. Taxed at the favourable entrepreneurs relief rate, which is 10%. But, like I said earlier on, what if Mr. X cannot afford to buy out Mr. Y? And he doesn't want to gear up, he doesn't want a bank loan, he doesn't want to get funds. But he says, you know what, hang on a minute. The company that we have is reasonably flush with cash. Why not have the company buy back the shares from Mr. Y? Same result, right? Mr. Y gets his $500,000, just comes from the company instead of from Mr. X, and Mr. X becomes the sole shareholder to control the business on his own going forward. Same result, right? Well, not necessarily, because it's not a guaranteed done deal that Mr. Y will obtain the favourable entrepreneurs relief of 10% capital gains tax on that gain. There's several hoops that have to be jumped through to get what we call capital treatment on a purchase of own shares in a limited company. So what are those conditions? Well, conditions for the CGT treatment. First of all, 5 years. So Mr. Y must have held the shares for at least 5 years. So if these guys have only been in business together for 3 or 4 years, that won't qualify, unless it can be less than 5 years, can sometimes be 3 years if, say, Mr. Y had inherited those shares through a will or intestacy of a previously a deceased previous shareholder. So if he'd come across his shares by being left them in a will, that 5-year ownership requirement goes down to 3, but I would suggest the vast majority of people in this situation that does not apply. They have not acquired their shares through a will or intestacy, but they've subscribed for them at some point, often at par when the business was started. So 5 years. Substantially reduced, that is the next thing. So Mr. Y has to substantially reduce his partaking of the business, the involvement in the business. Now, if he's selling out all of his shares, then yes, he's going to achieve that requirement. The requirement is 75%. So you have to have no more than 75% of the share level that you had previously before the buyback. So the buyback doesn't have to be an all or nothing. You don't have to buy back all of the shares, but as long as you have no more than 70% of the level that you had before, again, it ticks the box for the CGT treatment, the favourable capital gains tax treatment. to apply. But we'll come back to that because there's an interesting quirk on this substantially reduce rule. So remember, it doesn't have to drop by 70%. It just can't be more than 75% of what it was. So in other words, it's got to drop by at least 25%. Next condition, UK resident Mr. Y may have retirement plans to go and emigrate somewhere warm, to hotter climes. Maybe he might want to go off to Spain or the Caribbean. But all this needs to be done before he emigrates. He has to be UK resident at the time of doing the share buyback deal with the company. He can't emigrate and then sell his shares and hope to get favourable CGT treatment. Benefit of the business. So there has to be a benefit to the business of doing this whole arrangement. Now, normally the benefit that you'd say, if HMRC looked into this, is to say it's for the benefit of the continuation of the business, that we've got older shareholders looking to retire, we've got fresh young blood here, wants to get rid of some of the dead wood, and it's not very hard to convince HMRC of that fact, that there is a genuine benefit for the business case of buyback of shares from departing shareholders. Although there are certain things to look out for, which HMRC may say is not for the benefit of the business, but by and large, that's quite an easy hurdle to get over. Next one is a trading company. So this cannot apply to, say, a property investing company. If all these guys do is hold investment properties, it's got to be a trading business. And you can also get pre-clearance. So just to have a bit of comfort before the transaction, you write a clearance letter to HMRC setting out all the steps, why you think this qualifies for favourable CGT treatment, listing out all of these conditions, just so you have peace of mind that you are doing it right and not falling foul of the rules. Because when I talk about falling foul of the rules, what happens is, if you don't meet all these criteria, you will not get CGT treatment. And this guy here, Mr. Y, he will be taxed on his $500,000 as if it was a dividend, not as a capital gain. And as we know, capital gains tax for entrepreneurs relief, 10%, very good. It's a low rate of tax. But dividend tax starts off being pretty good. It's about 7.5%. Well, it's not about, it is 7.5% in the basic rate band. Basic rate band is exhausted at 50 grand. And then anything above jumps up to 33%. And then 38% when you get over 150 grand. So the last thing in the world that Mr. Y wants is for his, when he sells his shares to the company, he doesn't want to be landed with a tax bill in excess of 30% when he could have got 10% capital gains tax entrepreneurs relief. So yes, in theory, he can get the same tax result as if Mr. X had bought his shares rather than the company buyback, but there are hoops to be jumped through if it is through the company buyback route. Now, coming back to one of the points on substantially reduce, what often happens is that the company might not be able to afford to pay Mr. Y, in this case, all in one go. So let's say that £500,000, let's say that one of the conditions as well is that there are enough distributable reserves on the balance sheet. So let's say we've got P&L reserves in the trading company of at least £500,000. But the cash, obviously, if we're familiar with company balance sheets, doesn't necessarily follow that because you've got P&L reserves of £500,000, you're going to have cash to match it. So what you can do is say, okay, well, we tick the box that there are P&L reserves of £500,000, but there's not enough cash. Why don't we do a staged payment arrangement? So you contract to sell, so Mr. Y contracts with the company to sell his shares, but he gets paid out on the drip. So let's say he gets paid out 100 grand for 5 years. So crucially, remember, you've got to satisfy this condition, substantial reduction. He has to reduce his shareholding by at least 25% each time. But of course, if he's being paid out 100 grand over 5 years, he's only dropping 20% each time. 20% of his 50% holding each time, a fifth. So he's not meeting that criteria. So how these agreements are drafted, and you really need to take care with this and get specialist lawyers involved, is that you have a contract that effectively has one date. It's complete for capital gains tax purposes. Everything happens on the first date of the deal. In other words, legally, he offloads all of his shares on day one, even though he may get paid out in stages over 5 years. So technically, he's not offloading 20% of his shares on day one, another 20% of his shares after year one, another 20% after year two, and so on. No, he's offloading all of his shares on day one. So he meets this substantial reduction test, but he is getting paid out over several years. And it's all about the wording of the contract, and that is crucial. And that businesses over the years have fallen foul of that by not drafting the agreement properly, which then falls foul specifically of that rule. Substantial reduction and CGT relief has been denied. So quite a lot of hoops to go through, but shouldn't be insurmountable. And like I said, obviously, finally you get peace of mind by having the tax clearance where HMRC will write back and say, yes, if you just follow what you told us you're going to do, you'll get your favourable CGT treatment. So that is something to look at if you are either Mr. X or Mr. Y, particularly if you're Mr. Y, because he's the one that's it could be denied the paying 10% on his proceeds from his sale instead of it could be hit with 35% or instead of 10%. Obviously, Mr. X, he needs to know what's going on here as well. So if you are in this situation, considering one of the shareholders retiring, exiting for whatever reason, as long as it's for the benefit of the business, and I would suggest most reasons are, then buyback of own shares from the company rather than Mr. X going to the bank and taking out a substantial loan. So that's just an overview there on the purchase of own shares by small SME businesses. Like I said, I've done a separate video on share buybacks for PLCs. If you're an investor in those types of businesses in the stock market, totally different ball game altogether. But this is all about SME businesses. So if you like this video, please do subscribe right there. And as always, I'll see you soon.